The old gray pickup truck rolled to a quiet stop along the sun-bleached road that cut through the heart of the southern town. The air shimmered with heat, rising from the asphalt in lazy waves. John Carter, an aging black veteran in his 70s with silver-flecked hair and a spine worn by decades of war and labor, pulled the door open and climbed out with a slow, practiced grace. His knees protested with every motion, but he kept moving, steady as the sunrise. The sign above the little building read, "Tom's Diner, good food, better company." It had hung in that same spot for over 50 years, its paint faded by time, but its meaning still warm in the memories of many. For John, this diner wasn't just a place to eat, it was tradition. Every Saturday morning, without fail, he came for a cup of coffee and a slice of the best apple pie in the county. For years, it had been his quiet ritual, the same stool at the counter, the same creak of the doorbell above, the same nods and smiles from people who had seen him as a fixture in their town, even if they never truly knew him. But today, something was off. As John pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of the bells overhead echoed into a silence he didn't expect. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee still lingered in the air, comforting and familiar, but the hum of conversation had died the moment he stepped in. Every head turned, every voice fell, and in that breathless hush he felt something ancient and cold wrap itself around his chest. He nodded politely, trying to dismiss the tension as some odd coincidence. Maybe someone had dropped a plate. Maybe the power had flickered. Maybe it was just in his head, soldier's instinct, he told himself. Too many years reading danger in shadows, but the silence didn't lift. He made his way to the third stool from the left, the one that had become his over the years, and sat down. Slowly, carefully. The counter felt cooler than usual beneath his fingers. Then, from the kitchen doorway, Tom Harris emerged. Tom, the owner, a man John had known for more than a decade. He wasn't a close friend, but they'd exchanged holiday greetings, shared the odd story about their fathers and childhood mischief. Tom had once said, "You're the kind of man I wish my dad had been, John." That had meant something at the time, but now Tom's eyes didn't carry recognition. His smile, once casual and welcoming, was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped grimace. His brow furrowed, his jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice was rough and unfamiliar. "What can I get you today, John?" John blinked, unsure for a moment whether this was a joke. "Just the usual," he said gently. "Coffee and a slice of your famous apple pie." Tom didn't move. His knuckles whitened as they gripped the edge of the counter. "We're out of pie," he said. John looked to his left, where a fresh pie sat behind the glass display, steam still fogging the inside. He smiled politely. "Looks like there's still a full one right there." Tom's voice rose sharply, slicing through the room like broken glass. "I said we're out. Matter of fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." John sat frozen. For a long second, his breath caught in his chest. He looked around the diner. Every eye was on him again, some wide with shock, others narrowed in shame or embarrassment. A few looked away. John slowly stood. "Tom, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong?" Tom sneered. "You did plenty just by walking in here. I don't serve your kind in my place. Now get out before I call the cops." The words didn't just sting, they tore through something fragile and deep. Something that had taken decades to build. For a moment, John wasn't in 2020-something. He was back in 1963, standing outside a restaurant in Georgia with a sign in the window that said, "No coloreds allowed." But that was a long time ago, and this was Tom. John looked at him, trying to find any trace of the man he used to respect. But there was nothing left. Just hate wearing the face of someone who had once nodded across the counter and asked about his grandkids. As John turned to leave, shoulders heavy, a young woman stood up from her booth. Her voice trembled. "This isn't right. You can't treat him like this." Tom spun on her, fury darkening his face. "This is my diner, my rules. You don't like it, you can leave too." And she did. She hesitated, then lowered her eyes and sat back down. Her courage had flared for a moment, but the weight of fear pressed her back into her seat. John stepped out into the sunlight, but it no longer felt warm. He walked to his truck like a man carrying a secret no one wanted to see. When he closed the door behind him, the silence inside the vehicle felt louder than the whole world. For a long while, he didn't move. The steering wheel trembled in his hands. He had fought in wars, buried friends, held comrades as they took their last breath halfway across the world. He had watched his country struggle to keep its promise of equality, and he had waited, patiently, faithfully, for the world to become better than it was. But now he sat outside a place that once felt like home, kicked out like a stranger, shamed like a criminal. He could leave, he could drive away, pretend it didn't happen, write it off as one man's ignorance. But something inside him shifted. He straightened. His breathing steadied, and deep behind his eyes a fire lit. Because John Carter was not just a veteran. He was not just an old man with a soft smile and a quiet way of speaking. He was a father. And his son? Well, Tom Harris had just insulted the wrong man's father. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet office lined with legal briefs and campaign banners, Senator Michael Carter paused mid-sentence. His aide had just stepped in, eyes serious, voice low. "Sir, there's been an incident back home." Michael's hands stilled over a folder marked Veterans' Rights Initiative. He had been preparing for a press briefing, just another day on Capitol Hill, but something in the aide's tone made his stomach tighten. "What kind of incident?" The aide hesitated. "It's your father, sir. He was refused service. At Tom's diner, there's video and witnesses. They say it was racially motivated." For a long second, the world seemed to tilt. Michael's mouth went dry. He reached for the phone without another word. It rang 3 times before an old, familiar voice answered. "Hello, Dad." Michael's voice broke with a mixture of love and fury. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" There was a pause, then. "I'm all right, son. Just tired. It's been a long day." Michael closed his eyes. That voice, so steady, so calm. The same voice that used to read him stories when he was 6, that taught him to stand tall when the kids laughed at his skin, his speech, his name. That voice should never have had to whisper through pain. "I'm coming down," Michael said. "This ends now." By the next morning, the whispers had grown into a storm. Outside Tom's diner, protesters stood in quiet defiance. Signs read "No TO hate, respect our veterans, dignity for all." Some had come from neighboring towns. Others were locals who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen what they'd seen. Inside, Tom stood behind the counter, pretending the walls weren't closing in. He burned the eggs. He dropped a plate. He glared at every customer who dared to look at him too long. The phone rang off the hook. Reporters, local activists, even an Army base chaplain demanding an explanation. But Tom clung to the belief that he'd done the right thing, that he was standing by principle. He didn't see a man he hurt, only a system he feared was slipping away. One where his father's voice still echoed in his ear, hissing about pride and bloodlines and who deserved to be served. Then the bell over the door rang. The room hushed. A man stepped in, dressed not in military green or hometown flannel, but in a tailored Navy suit. He moved like someone used to being watched, like someone used to walking into rooms where the stakes were measured in more than coffee and tips. Michael Carter, Senator of the United States, son of John Carter. Tom's heart stuttered. Michael didn't sit. He didn't smile. He simply stepped up to the counter and said, "Are you Tom Harris?" Tom nodded stiffly. Michael's eyes were calm. But beneath that calm was fury, leashed, focused. "You refused service to my father yesterday, a decorated war veteran, a man who's lived in this town longer than this diner's been standing." Tom puffed his chest. "This is my place. I serve who I choose." Michael nodded slowly. "On what grounds?" Tom faltered. "He made some people uncomfortable." Michael leaned in. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "What made you uncomfortable, Mr. Harris? The uniform he wore, the medals he earned, or the color of the skin that bled for this country?" Tom's lips curled. "I don't need to explain myself to you." "No," Michael said, stepping back. "But you will explain yourself to the federal investigation we're launching into your discriminatory business practices, and the civil lawsuit my office will be filing, and the Veterans Alliance protest scheduled for this weekend, and the national news story you're about to become the face of." Silence, cold and heavy. "You made a mistake," Michael said, turning toward the door, "and you picked the wrong man to humiliate." Tom's knees wobbled. He reached out for the counter to steady himself, but the edges had already started to blur. Because for the first time in his life, Tom realized that the world wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving forward, with or without him. Across town, John Carter sat quietly on his porch, watching the sunlight bend through the trees. He held a photograph of his late wife, Margaret, her smile soft, her eyes bright, her memory eternal. "I wish you could see him, Maggie," he whispered. "Our boy a storm, and he's gonna clean this town." Michael joined him just before dusk. No cameras, no reporters, just father and son side by side. "I didn't want this," John said softly. "I didn't want it to become a war." Michael nodded. "I know, but sometimes peace only grows where injustice is uprooted." They sat in silence for a while. The air was thick with jasmine and old wounds. Then Michael said, "Dad, what if we bought the diner?" John turned. "What?" I mean it, I've already spoken to some folks. The place is struggling. Tom's in more debt than he lets on. What if we took it and turned it into something better? John raised a brow. You want to run a diner? Michael smiled faintly. No, I want to rebuild a town, one table at a time. John laughed for the first time in days. That's the most Carter thing I've ever heard. By the end of the week, Tom received an envelope under his door. Inside, a formal offer to buy the diner. It was more than fair, nearly double the market price. The only condition, he leave. Quietly, immediately, no reopening, no rival establishment, just gone. Tom stared at the letter for a long time. It smelled like finality. It tasted like shame. He wanted to tear it up. He wanted to shout. He wanted to crawl back into the time when his father's world still made sense. But that time was gone, and somewhere in his chest something cracked open, a silence that begged to be filled. Days later, the town awoke to a surprising sight. The diner, once bearing the name Tom's, now had a new sign being installed, the Veterans Table. Below it, in smaller letters, a place for every story, a seat for every soul. The workers arrived before sunrise, moving quickly and respectfully. They didn't play music. They didn't talk much. It was as if they sensed what the moment required, quiet reverence for something long overdue. And standing there in the growing light, watching every letter being lifted into place, was John Carter. He wasn't wearing anything fancy, just an old denim jacket and the faded army cap he'd had since 1975. His hands were in his pockets and his face was still and unreadable. But inside, something was shifting, not just for him, but for the entire town. Word had already spread. People came by, slow at first, like testing the water. A woman brought her 2 sons, showed them the new sign, told them, "This is where change starts." A group of teenagers stopped by on skateboards, unsure of what to say, but left flowers by the window anyway. Then a white-haired man from the VFW post came, took off his own cap, and saluted the building in silence. No one said the word racism aloud. No one needed to. It was in the air, finally named, finally faced, no longer whispered about behind closed doors. Inside, the changes were even more striking. The counter remained, but the walls were different. Where once there had been faded autographed photos and sports pennants, now there were portraits of veterans from all backgrounds, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American. Men, women, some young, some long gone, all honored equally. Michael had brought in a team of volunteers to help redesign the space. And with every hammer stroke, every coat of fresh paint, they weren't just rebuilding a diner, they were replanting a seed. A seed of belonging, of dignity, of story. The idea was simple. Anyone could come here, sit down, and be heard. You didn't have to order food, you didn't have to prove anything, you just had to show up. That was the cost of a seat, presence. And that was revolutionary in its own quiet way. John didn't speak much during the renovation. He showed up every morning, swept the front steps, nodded to the workers, and then sat on the same stool he used to sit on before Tom told him to leave. Only this time it was his stool, his place. And when someone came in, he greeted them, not like a host, but like a neighbor, like someone who still believed in community, even after all it had taken from him. He met a young veteran named Lewis, who said he'd never felt safe in town until now. He talked to Ms. Bailey, who'd lost her brother in Korea and always felt like no one remembered. They remembered now. And slowly the town began to change. The air wasn't so thick. The stairs weren't so cold. People apologized, not in grand gestures, but in smaller, more honest ways. A nod, a handshake, a quiet, "I should have said something that day." Not everyone changed. Some didn't come back, some never would, but those who stayed, stayed different. Then one morning, just before the official reopening, a young reporter came to do a story on the transformation. She asked John, "What made you come back?" He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Because if I didn't, that hate would have won. And I didn't fight wars overseas just to surrender here at home." She blinked, tears gathering, then lowered her camera for a moment. "Can I ask, what's the first thing you're going to eat when the doors open?" John smiled faintly. "Apple pie and coffee, just the way it used to be. Only now, maybe I'll get to share it." That afternoon, Michael joined his father at the counter. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The pie was warm, the coffee strong. And the silence between them, for the first time in a long while, was peace. Not just absence of conflict, but the presence of healing. The grand reopening of the veterans' table wasn't loud. It wasn't packed with cameras or flooded with press releases. It didn't have balloons or confetti or politicians shaking hands for photo ops. What it had was presence. Presence of those who had been invisible. Presence of stories long buried under silence. Presence of change, slow and unshouting, but permanent. The first person through the door was Clara Green, widow of Sergeant William Green, who died in Vietnam. She wore her husband's old dog tags and carried a folded flag in her arms like it was the most sacred thing she owned. She placed it on the corner booth under a small brass plaque that read, "Reserved for those who gave all." She didn't cry, she didn't need to. Her silence said more than any speech ever could. After her came Mr. and Mrs. Camel, refugees from Syria who had opened a grocery store down the street. They brought baklava on a tray, offered it to everyone. "We are honored to be part of this," they said, hands pressed over their hearts. Then Lewis, the young veteran who'd met John weeks before, rolled in on his wheelchair, wearing a grin that looked too big for his face. "I never thought I'd say this," he said, "but this is the first time I've felt proud to be from this town." The menu hadn't changed much. Coffee, pie, a few hot meals, nothing fancy. But the walls now held testimonials from veterans and families, each framed and lit with care. A local artist had painted a mural across the back wall, hands of different colors lifting a folded flag together. In the center, a child offering a slice of pie to an older man with silver hair and tired eyes. It was unmistakably John. When he saw it, he just chuckled. "I don't look that gentle in real life," he joked. But everyone knew he did. Word spread beyond the town. People started traveling in, some veterans, some just curious. A man drove 4 hours just to sit at the counter and say thank you. A woman whose father had died without ever receiving his medals brought her son and said, "This is what I wanted him to see, not the White House. This." Tom Harris never returned. He sold his house quietly, disappeared from the public eye. No one really knew where he went. Some said he moved down south. Others said he never really left, just faded into the background, watching the diner from a distance, too ashamed to step foot near what it had become. No one chased him. No one hated him, they just moved on. Because this story wasn't about him anymore, it never really was. It was about a man who chose dignity over vengeance. A son who turned pain into policy, a town that stopped looking away. One evening, months later, after the sun had dipped below the trees and the air turned cool, John sat on the porch again. Next to him was Michael, who had returned from Washington for a weekend without suits, just sweatshirts and laughter. They watched as the lights of the diner flickered on, soft, golden, welcoming. Across the street, a young couple helped an elderly woman step up the curb. At the window, Clara Green waved to a teenager who had once thrown rocks at her mailbox, but now delivered soup every Friday. John said, "It's not about forgiveness, you know, it's about what we do next." Michael nodded, "It always is." And then, as if summoned by memory, the sound of a screen door creaked open. A little girl ran out from the house behind them, Michael's daughter, hair wild and full of questions. She climbed into John's lap, looked at him with serious eyes, and asked, "Grandpa, were you ever scared?" John looked at her, really looked. "Yes," he said, "but I did it anyway, because some things are worth standing up for, even when your knees don't agree." She giggled, kissed his cheek, and ran back inside. Michael smiled. "She's gonna change the world, you know." John nodded slowly. "She already has." And there, in the quiet hum of twilight, surrounded by pie crumbs, jasmine in bloom, and the gentle ticking of a world trying to become better, peace settled in. Not perfect peace, but earned. And for the first time in a long, long while, John Carter let himself rest.